But first on earth as vampire sent, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood from all thy race. Those lines are from a poem published by Lord Byron in 1813, and at the time of their publication, they were revolutionary. Nowadays, we've all grown up on stories of vampires, jokes about strong accents and wanting to suck your blood, high-collared polyester capes, plastic fangs, and Halloween gift bags. Whether it's the castle-dwelling counts of early Hollywood or the early 2000s sparkly bad boys, it's hard to imagine a time when the vampire wasn't a part of the monstrous landscape of our imaginations. Vampires are a relatively contemporary creation, but since they launched themselves into the mainstream, they have stuck, somehow being the perfect encompassment of all of our fears of change, our fears of alienation. They've fallen into the crux of the never-ending debate on what it means to be human in the face of monstrosity. Today, I'm going to walk you through a review of the vampire story, from its murky origins in ancient myths, to its sudden rise in popularity in the Enlightenment, to its modern-day infamy. You see, vampires might not be real in the strictest of senses, but there is a reason we've reinvented this monster time and time again, and there's a lot that can be learned about us, the inventors of this modern monster. So sit down, relax, grab yourself a glass of wine, and just remember that vampires aren't real, and I don't bite much. Before we get into it, I'm going to give a couple of disclaimers. Unsurprisingly, this is going to be a fairly gory video. I'm going to try and be tasteful, but there's a lot of talk about gruesome death and blood, so if you're not up to that, go ahead and click away, and I'll see you next week. And as much as I would love to be the one to introduce your children to horrors beyond their comprehension, I do not want to be held responsible for any nightmares that this video is going to give them. So if you have any children, perhaps usher them out of the room before the rest of this video plays. Also, it is entirely likely that if I mention a piece of media, I am going to give some form of spoilers for it. If you are spoiler conscious and there's a particular thing you don't want to have spoiled for you, I will be putting a timestamp right around here every time I start talking about a new piece of media, and you can go ahead and skip that if you want to avoid spoilers. I'm not going to be saying anything about it out loud because I would be saying it constantly, but if you don't want to get spoiled, go ahead and skip around at your own risk. I can't exactly give you a neat definition of the vampire because, as I said, they're not real. A vampire can be pretty much anything that you call a vampire. But the generally accepted idea is that a vampire is something that feeds on the energy and typically, especially in the modern day, the blood of the living. The origins of the word itself are also a little bit confusing, but we can roughly trace them back to the Turkish word Uber, which means witch. Vampire-esque myths can be found around the world and throughout history. Ancient Greece gave us the Vraikalaikas, sinful spirits that would inhabit these swollen red balloon-like bodies with ragged hair and nails, and they would feed on the blood of young, lively men. 11th century Sanskrit stories tell us of the Hindu Baital, a half-man, half-bat spirit creature that would fly around feeding on the flesh and blood of the young. From Malaysia, we get my favorite, or maybe it's my least favorite vampire creature, the Penanggalan. Their name means to detach, and that is because these creatures were always female, and they could walk around during the day looking perfectly normal, but at night they could unscrew their heads and take flight, dragging their disemboweled organs behind them. They like to target women in labor, draining and killing them for their life energy. Echoes of this general concept of evil corpse-like beings preying upon the living really took hold in Eastern and Central Europe. Germans told of the Nachtzehrer, or the shroud chewers, deceased people who gnawed holes in their burial shrouds and could influence the living. And in Poland and Russia, they feared creatures such as the Striga. The striga could walk in the dusk light, and they would go to drain the blood from the living before returning to their coffins bloated with the blood of those they had attacked. The only way to defeat a striga was to pop open the coffin and cut off the head of it to deflate it. This is probably the goriest part of an already kind of gross video, so go ahead and skip like 30 seconds ahead if you don't want to hear something really nasty. But apparently, one of the methods for healing people who had been attacked by the striga would be to behead it, and then to take the fluids, you know, the blood, but also the other fluids from the coffin, bake it into bread, and then feed it to the afflicted people. It is truly, truly vile. Fortunately, not everybody destroyed vampires that way. We have plenty of evidence of people using methods like beheading and garlic flowers and iron or wooden stakes through the chest. We actually have significant archaeological evidence nowadays of what people call vampire burials. Skeletons can be found with great iron rods lodged through their chest cavities, sickles would be placed over the throats of the deceased to keep them from rising, and bricks and stones will be shoved into their mouths to keep them from gnawing on their shrouds. While we can't know for certain that these are specifically connected to a vampire myth, it does hint that there was a lingering fear, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, of the dead, and there were efforts gone to keep the dead in their graves. All of these myths range significantly in the details, but the point is that there was a distinct fear that the dead were going to affect the living. Now, we could take this the conspiracy theorist route and say that the government is hiding Edward Cullen from you and vampires are real, or we could go with the simpler solution, and that is the fact that throughout human history, we have had a lot of lingering fear around the dead. And death was even more terrifying before we had things like germ theory or a competent understanding of human anatomy to explain what was going on. And corpses, the most tangible evidence that death happens, can do a lot of weird stuff post-mortem. Go ahead and check out Caitlin Dowdy's channel, which I'll link up here and down below if you want more professional information on this, especially her video on America's Forgotten Vampire Panic. But basically, in my own unprofessional words, while we like to imagine that once you put somebody in a grave, they immediately turn into a dusty, emaciated skeleton, that's just not true. Bodies break down very slowly, and there are a lot of factors that control how that breakdown occurs and how quickly it occurs. If you're buried in a mausoleum or a coffin, the temperature of the air, the temperature of the ground, the oxygen content of the soil, all of these can affect how and how quickly a body breaks down. And this is relevant because many of these vampire stories begin by people finding corpses that don't look dead enough. Their skin will be swollen and red and almost fresh looking instead of sagging and gray. They might even make noises in the grave, especially if you poke and prod them. There might be fresh blood sitting around their mouths. They might have even moved around in the coffin. In some cases, it even seemed that their hair and nails or their teeth had grown post-mortem. This was taken as signs that they weren't really dead. They were coming out and feeding on the living to live in an undead state. Now, modern science has allowed us to debunk pretty much all of that as the misunderstandings that they are. Bodies have a lot of fluids and a lot of gases in them, and a lot of these things are produced in the decaying process. With nowhere to go, the bodies swell up. And guess what? Just like a balloon, if you poke a hole in it, it's gonna make noise as it deflates. There's a lot of blood just in us. We're mostly blood, and so when our bodies are becoming goo, the mouth is a really great exit point for all of that goo to exit. That's why we would have fresh blood around the mouths. And corpses can sometimes thrash around post-mortem, so that explains why the bodies had moved around in the coffins. As a body decomposes, the skin will dry out and draw back, causing things like hair and nails to look longer. The lips may pull back from the teeth, and then suddenly you are looking at a long-fanged creature with blood around their mouths and fresh nails, hair, and skin, sometimes weeks or months after the person has been buried. Our science nowadays can tell us why all of these things happen, but to an uneducated peasant in the 1400s, it's gonna look like vampires. It was the best explanation they could come up with given the very limited amount of information that they had. Plus, vampirism could go on to explain a lot of other different strange phenomena. Common diseases like anemia and tuberculosis, which killed a lot of people at this time, would cause people to die with a very pale, gaunt, and bloodless appearance. Ailments like rabies would cause sudden aggression, a desire to bite, hydrophobia, meaning that they couldn't drink water, and it would sometimes even cause people to react strongly against garlic. Conditions like sleep paralysis may go a long way to explaining the experiences that people had, where they would wake at night frozen and hypnotized into stillness as their formerly dead neighbor preys upon them. These vampire stories are not made up out of thin air. They were not fiction. They were people trying their very hardest to put together clues with very limited information. It was like they were doing a puzzle with all of the pieces turned over and half of them missing. You know, you might not get the right picture, you might not get the picture that the puzzle was supposed to be, but it's kind of impressive that you get a picture at all. The human mind does not deal with the unknown with any sort of grace. We need explanations for communal diseases and strange decompositions, and the vampire legend was a very tempting one to believe. Illness is frightening. Even with all of our modern medical knowledge, we were all shaken to the core by the pandemic, and at least we knew sort of what was going on. Even before we had modern science, we created medicine, we invented solutions, we performed plague plays, and we had quarantines, we sniffed flowers, and we swung pregnant women on sheets. We created things that we thought might help, and sometimes, with just the way that things go, it looked like they did help. Let's take a look at a case study, the tale of Petar Blagojevic, a Serbian peasant who died of unknown causes in 1725. He was buried, but 10 weeks after his death, people in his village started dying. Many of these people would report that before they fell ill, Petar had come to them in the night and had threatened or choked them. In some cases, within 24 hours, people would fall ill and die. His widow even reported that Petar came to their house in the night, knocked on the door, demanded that she give him his shoes, and then he choked her when she didn't obey. Within just over a week, 9 people had died, and without any more rational causes, the blame fell on poor Petar Blagojevic. They dug him up, and what do you know? Apparently his corpse didn't smell bad at all. It smelled perfectly fine. His skin was taut and fresh looking, his fallen fingernails had been replaced with new ones, and there was blood on his mouth. They had a vampire. They staked him through the chest, and immediately blood burst out of his mouth and ears. For good measure, they decapitated him and burned his body, and the mysterious deaths stopped. From our modern perspective, we can write most of this off. The condition of Petar's body, maybe people had sleep paralysis, and as soon as one person reports death by a vampire, other people are going to, because that's how mass hysteria works. But what we cannot discredit is the comfort that hunting and killing the vampire Petar gave to people. It gave them something to do. Helplessness is possibly the greatest killer of all, and while it is not scientifically grounded by any means, vampire hunting was a great relief to people. It certainly beat witch hunts, which had come before that, because at least, you know, you're not burning somebody who's still alive. And vampire hunts were actually beating out witch hunts at this time. As we passed into the 16th century, witch hunts were falling out of favor, and vampire hunts were taking their place. I understand why this transition happened, because to believe in witches, you had to accept the supernatural. You had to accept demons and devils and women flying around on broomsticks. In a newly rationalizing world, this wasn't really in vogue anymore. But vampires seemed almost like they could be real. Sometimes destroying a vampire would help. It would alleviate mass hysteria, and honestly, burial practices at this time weren't great, and people just kind of buried bodies wherever because it was too expensive to bury them in an actual graveyard. So believe it or not, but burning that corpse that you have buried 2 feet below the ground in your backyard might actually keep you from feeling sick. Reports of stories like that of Peter Blagojevich were published in newspapers where they could be picked apart by the new educated minds of the Enlightenment. They were putting aside the superstitious beliefs of the old world and examining these stories through a new scientific lens. Suddenly, these vampire myths, which were once really scattered and unspecific, were being written down and categorized. You could find documents listing why somebody might become a vampire, such as a sinful life, an incorrect burial, or even something like a cat jumping over the coffin before it could be put into the ground. You could run down a checklist of 10 reasons your old pal might be a vampire, such as their family falling sick, there being holes in their headstones that their spirits could escape, and the most telling one, if a gander of geese refuses to walk over the grave. And then there were plenty of ways to eliminate this danger. You could use garlic flowers, you could bring in a priest to bless them, or of course there's the old standby of beheading and burning. It was in the 17th and especially the 18th century that these ideas were distilled, and we got the recognizable form of the vampire that we see today, complete with traits such as being undead specifically, and drinking blood. Through the 18th century, this very scientific approach to folklore became more and more popular, and even as actual genuine belief in the reality of vampires faded, their importance did not wane. In his piece on imaginary diseases, Cohen Vermeer writes, "The perception of vampirism shifted from a disease of the imagination to an imaginary disease. Vampires were an Eastern European phenomenon, arising where cultures mixed at the crossroads of Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant beliefs, at the shifting borders of the great Central European and Ottoman empires, in a time of regional, political, and religious upheaval. Liminal creatures from the East, they came to haunt the Western imagination." Vampires were at the very heart of the debate happening at this time between science and imagination. Right on this threshold between the superstitious past and the rational future, vampires were able to hitch a ride into the modern era. But with true belief largely dismissed by science, vampires had to find a new home for themselves, and they found that in literature. Vampires appeared here and there, especially in poetry of the 18th and 19th century, but they were hurled into the limelight by the 1819 short story, The Vampire. In its original magazine publication, the authorship of The Vampire was attributed to the eternally infamous Lord George Byron. It would take me an actual age to go through all of the reasons why Lord Byron gained such infamy, but let's just say he was messy. He had constant affairs with very high-profile people, a fairly public struggle with his sexuality and his identity, and he was just overall a gallivanting, chaotic mess. The Vampire tells the story of a gentleman named Aubrey, who meets the elusive and mysterious Lord Ruthven. He's pulled into Lord Ruthven's orbit, and they decide to take a tour of the country together. His peculiarities caused him to be invited to every house. All wished to see him, and those who had been accustomed to violent excitement, and now felt the weight of ennui, were pleased at having something in their presence capable of engaging their attention. With his quick tongue and preternatural appeal, Lord Ruthven seduces his way across civilization, leaving pain and destruction and chaos in his wake. Disgusted by this behavior, Aubrey eventually breaks off from Lord Ruthven, whereupon he learns about the little folklore legend of the vampire. These creatures were known to feed on young women to prolong their immortal lives, pale in appearance until they gorge themselves on blood, whereupon they become flushed and vivacious. Aubrey realizes that a lot of Lord Ruthven's behavior lines up pretty well with this myth, but before he can tell anyone about this, he falls suddenly extremely ill, and he has to be nursed back to health by Lord Ruthven, who returns to save him. This is enough to put him back in Aubrey's good graces, and the two travel together for a little while longer while Aubrey sets aside his suspicions. However, in their travels, they are attacked and Lord Ruthven is mortally wounded, and as he lays dying, he makes Aubrey swear that he will not tell his story, he will not speak of Lord Ruthven's death, for a year after this point. Aubrey promises, because this is his dying friend, but that turns out to be a terrible mistake. He returns to London and finds that Lord Ruthven is miraculously alive, still strutting his way through society. And out of the weight of his promise and sheer shock, Aubrey is choked into silence, forced to watch as Lord Ruthven seduces, marries, and then slaughters Aubrey's sister. The stress kills Aubrey, but not before he can dictate the tale of the vampire. The Vampire is a highly evocative story, which takes the myths of the old world and reshapes them for a new century. No longer are these vampires hideous alien creatures. Now they're suave, arming themselves with all the frills and finery of high society and using this to their advantage, slipping into the hearth and home of his victims to drain their life force to feed the black void of their soul. The Vampire was a very well-received short story, bolstered by the reputation of Lord Byron, who was supposedly the author, who, let's just say, has a couple of things in common with Lord Ruthven. It was a salacious and scandalous story, made all the more scandalous by Byron's already pretty terrible reputation. But the thing is that Lord Byron isn't actually the author. After that initial publication, the true author of The Vampire, John Polidori, wrote to the publisher to explain the confusion. Apparently, Polidori had gotten the idea for the story from Lord Byron. In the summer of 1816, Polidori was one of a very special party who was invited to Lake Geneva to while away the summer hours with Lord Byron. This party, which included Percy Shelley and his wife Mary Shelley, would get together and tell ghost stories on rainy nights. This became a competition of sorts, as they would part during the day to go and write their stories, and then join back together to share and compare them. Mary Shelley wrote up a little something titled Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, and Lord Byron told a fragmented, unfinished story with vampiric themes. John Polidori, who was Lord Byron's physician at the time, took this little scrap of a story and fleshed it out into The Vampire, likely utilizing a lot of the details and the vibe of Lord Byron's actual life. Shortly after that summer of 1816, Byron dismissed Polidori from his employment, and I don't think that it's controversial to say that some of his bitterness about this sudden dismissal and the loss of Byron's friendship may have caused some bitterness in the writing of The Vampire. We end up with this presentation of a character that is suave, put together, and highly desirable, but entirely morally corrupt. How fitting is it that this very first popular vampire story was birthed out of a sort of vampirism of its own. While John Polidori is a talented writer on his own, he most certainly leached a lot of his inspiration from Lord Byron. The mad exploits, the playfully destructive relationship with high society, even some of Lord Byron's personal relationships are mirrored by Lord Ruthven. You could say they were stolen, you could say they were borrowed, but either way, these things were not originally John Polidori's. The vampire paved the way for the vampire story of the New Age. Once a fragmented and scattered story, a nebulous myth nearly gusted away by the winds of 18th century Enlightenment, the vampire character had been given a shape, and what a lasting shape it would be. Throughout the Victorian period, the vampire would cling to the Western imagination, especially vampires in this new Byronic form. In 1845, the first of the Penny Dreadful series, Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, was published. These weekly serials told the story of Varney, a blood-sucking vamp with a sympathetic side. He was tall and gaunt, and he treated vampirism as if it was a curse, one he was constantly trying in one way or another to get rid of. Varney the Vampire would be compiled into a complete novel in 1847, making it the very first full-length English-language vampire novel. In 1872, Irish writer Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu would shake up vampire literature with his short story, Carmilla. Carmilla is a story that is recounted by its narrator, Laura, who, as a child, experienced some rather supernatural events. I saw a solemn but very pretty face looking at me from the side of the bed. It was that of a young lady who was kneeling with her hands under the coverlet. I looked at her with a kind of pleased wonder and ceased whimpering. She caressed me with her hands and lay down beside me on the bed and drew me towards her, smiling. I felt immediately delightfully soothed and fell asleep again. I was awakened by a sensation as if 2 needles ran into my breast very deep at the same moment, and I cried loudly. The lady started back with her eyes fixed on me, and then slipped down onto the floor and, as I thought, hid herself under the bed. This experience, part night terror, part memory, sticks with Laura as she matures into an intelligent but lonely teen, her father and nursemaid her only company. Their solitude is broken by the arrival of a girl named Carmilla, whose face is eerily familiar to Laura. Laura and Carmilla grow incredibly close, despite Carmilla's moods. While sometimes she can be sweet and engaging, she also can be incredibly harsh and snappy sometimes. She despises the sound of sacred music, she gets frustrated every time Laura begins praying, and nobody ever sees her walking about during the day. Before long, Laura falls ill with a strange ailment that has been killing girls in the village, and her father has no idea how to help her. It isn't until a family friend arrives bearing news of his own daughter's death from this same condition that things begin to become clear. His daughter's death was heralded in by the arrival of a strange and beautiful girl named Millarca, who became very close friends with his daughter. They realized that Carmilla is a vampire, the undead Countess Mircalla, cursed to live forever, feeding on the blood of young girls, and always forced to use a pseudonym that shares all of the same letters with her original name. This was Laura's youthful nightmare piercing her breast, returned to finish the job. They eliminate Carmilla, staking and burning her, but the effects of Carmilla's seduction never truly leave Laura. Carmilla is a deeply gothic tale, titillating and disturbing, diving its fingers deep into the concerns of the day, the growing power of women, and the perceived danger of female relationships. There was a lot of concern that strong female relationships could overturn the patriarchal system, causing everything to spiral into moral and functional chaos. The story ends with the defeat of the subversive female vampire, but her echoes remain long after. Laura will never truly forget just how useless the men in her life were to prevent her from being taken by Carmilla's power. By the end of the 19th century, vampire literature had firmly established itself as something quite different from the myths it had risen from. It was the peak form of Gothic literature, asking and roundly refusing to answer some of the most difficult questions about life, existence, and the place of an individual in society. But we would not have the vampire mythos that we have today if not for Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula. Dracula blended together all of the best parts of the vampire mythos to come out with one of the most recognizable villains in all of horror. Bram Stoker evoked the gentleman vampire of John Polidori, responded to the subversive themes in Carmilla, and integrated the myths of the old world in a way that no one up until this point had accomplished. Even the name of the villain, Dracula, calls back to long bygone days. It summons up images of one of Europe's most looming historical figures, Vladislav Dracula. Vlad Dracula was the son of Vlad II Dracul, the voivode of Wallachia in the 15th century. His family got the name Dracul when they joined the Order of the Dragon, a knightly order dedicated to defending Eastern Europe from the Ottomans. Back then, Drac translated to dragon, but now in modern Romanian, it translates to devil. Because he was the son of Vlad Dracul, Vlad III took on the diminutive form of that name, becoming Vlad Dracula. And as cool as that name is, and it is very cool, he is better known by his moniker Vlad Tepes, or in English, Vlad the Impaler. When he took over Wallachia in 1456, Vlad was determined to rule his country with an iron fist. He wanted to keep them safe from Ottoman invaders, but he also wanted to uphold his very strict moral code. He had a particular fixation on women's purity and would punish anyone that violated his moral standards, and it was these punishments that he became best known for. Most famously, he was the Impaler. He would take a victim and tie each of their legs to a horse, and then he would take a long wooden stake and drive it through them from bottom to top. Once they were on there, he would prop the stake upright and allow gravity to do its work, pulling them further and further onto the stake. This torture would sometimes be drawn out for hours as these people slowly bled out. And while this was his preferred method of execution, according to reports, he was also known for burning villages and perhaps even engaging in cannibalism. Vlad Tepes is estimated to have killed anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 people, and reports of the day speak of enemies stumbling across forests of stakes, a victim left upon each, left to rot for months at a time. So that is a lot to take in, but it should definitely be noted that many of these reports came from his enemies. His own subjects actually rather admired Vlad Dracula, as they saw him as a very bold defender of his country. Apparently, he was very intelligent in battle with his strategies, and he was also incredibly loyal to those that were his allies. And you know what, I'm not gonna try and make an argument that it was ever okay to impale or eat people, but it should be noted that this was way before the days of the Geneva Conventions. The standard for battle at the time was just different, and it wasn't that out of the ordinary for a ruler to engage in a little bit of casual torture during war. Whatever the truth is there, though, Vlad Tepes made a hell of a reputation for himself, one that continued right up until his death. He died sometime before 1477, but we've never been able to find his grave, and we don't know how he died, which only adds to his legend. Some people theorize that he ended up in the Snagov Monastery near Bucharest, because they found a tomb there with silk brocade clothing, which looked very similar to a portrait that we know we have of Vlad Dracula, and there was also a crown in there, and a ring with a symbol that looked a lot like the sigil for the Order of the Dragon. And that's all very promising, except that in transportation to a museum, these remains vanished and have never been found again. These are the sort of sordid, bloody, downright bizarre historical myths that Bram Stoker was recalling in the creation of Dracula. Sure, he never actually said that his Dracula was Vlad Dracula, but like, there's gotta be a connection there. That is one hill that I am willing to die on. Either way, Dracula burst onto the scene at the turn of the century and changed the vampire game forever. The novel Dracula is told through a sequence of letters, at first following Jonathan Harker, a solicitor sent to a strange castle in the Carpathian Mountains to help the elusive Count Dracula purchase property in London. He goes in there bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, excited to report back to his fiancée Mina at home, but this dream quickly pivots into a nightmare. The place is isolated and surrounded by fearful, superstitious villagers. The castle seems almost entirely deserted, just a servant or two and the Count himself. The Count is polite, but distant and unnerving. He never drinks wine, he never eats, and he never comes out during the day. From there, things only go more off the rails. Jonathan writes back to Mina about how one night he heard a noise and he looks out the window to see the Count crawling down the side of the castle, quote unquote, lizard fashion, completely defying the laws of gravity. Jonathan realizes when he's shaving at one point that the Count is not visible in mirrors. Jonathan wants to leave, but the Count will not let him, and he forces him to write these letters explaining why he has to stay a little bit longer. Jonathan Harker is well and truly trapped in Dracula's lair. After a few run-ins with a gang of 3 sexy vampire ladies who want his blood, Jonathan snaps and decides that he is going to hunt down the Count during the day while he's resting. Led by his gut feelings, he tracks down the Count to a strange chapel and to a massive coffin. He pries it open, revealing the Count in all his undead glory. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed, for the white hair and mustache were changed to dark iron gray, the cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and neck. Even the deep burning eyes seemed set amongst swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. Jonathan is unable to kill the Count in this moment, and so the beast makes his escape, using local villagers to get him onto a ship bound for London. Alone in the castle with his vampirous seductors, Jonathan makes a daring escape, and while he escapes, the stress and the escape incapacitate him, and he's left in a hospital nearby. Back home, Mina, Jonathan's fiancée, is dealing with her own issues. Her very best friend Lucy is beautiful and engaging, and she's batting off suitors with a stick. Most notably, one of her suitors is a cowboy. It's not really that important that he's a cowboy, I just really like that there's a cowboy involved in this story, and as I'm describing it, I want you to know that he is there. And he's a cowboy. One of her suitors, Dr. Seward, ends up being a point-of-view character. He runs a mental asylum, and we hear reports about his most notable patient, a madman named Renfield, who is obsessed with eating living things to gain their life force, and has pledged himself to an unnamed master. Mina is whisked away to go tend to Jonathan, and while she's gone, Lucy falls incredibly ill. It begins with fits of sleepwalking, but it soon escalates into long bouts of weakness and paleness, all seeming to originate from these two little holes in her neck. Dr. Seward is trying to treat Lucy, but when his expertise reaches its limits, he calls in the big guns, his former professor, Dr. Abraham von Helsing. Van Helsing has always been an open-minded scientist, and he immediately realizes that there's something special about Lucy's case. He gives her blood transfusions again and again for days, which seem to help temporarily, but in the morning, she nearly always wakes bloodless and pale once more. Van Helsing locks her windows at night, and he fills her room with crosses and garlic flowers, but it's not enough. Lucy dies and is buried. Soon after this, reports emerge of local children being lured into the shadows by a strange, beautiful woman walking at night, and Van Helsing's worst fears are confirmed. He admits that he believes Lucy has fallen prey to a vampire. She was slowly drained over a course of weeks, and now, in death, she walks again, preying upon children as once she was preyed upon. Van Helsing explains this to Dr. Seward, to Lucy's fiancé, and to the cowboy who sticks around, but it is a very tough pill for them to swallow. Van Helsing has to impress upon them the reality of this situation, that there is so much more to the world than what our eyes can show us. You are a clever man, friend John. You reason well, and your wit is bold, but you are too prejudiced. You do not let your eyes see, nor your ears hear, and that which is outside your daily life is not of account to you. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand, and yet which are? That some people see things that others cannot? Ah, it is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explain not, then it says there is nothing to explain. Now that you are willing to understand, you have taken the first steps to understand. Bolstered by this first spark of belief in the unknown, they go to Lucy's grave and open it, and there they find her untouched and undecayed, more beautiful and unnaturally alluring than she ever was before. Lucy is a vampire. In order to end her accursed undead existence and allow her soul entry to heaven, they are forced to deface Lucy's body, cutting off her head, staking her in the chest, and stuffing her mouth with garlic flowers. She screams horrifically at this, but the deed is done. Her soul is freed, and her part of the story has ended. But the Count's tale is only just beginning. Mina and Jonathan, who has barely recovered, return, and they're able to give his side of the story, his diaries from his time spent with Dracula. Even stranger, a ship has just come to shore, its entire crew dead, and its main cargo, boxes of dirt from the Carpathians. This was Dracula's ship. He drained the crew, and the boxes of dirt are there so that he can have a safe resting place once he arrives in London. At this point, all of these main characters, so that is Dr. Seward, Van Helsing, the cowboy, Lucy's fiancé, Jonathan and Mina, who are now married, they join together to form this little Dracula hunting gang, determined to rout his evil from the streets of London. What follows from here is what I would refer to as hijinks. I don't know, that's just how I read it. There's something very funny about how all of the men must go together as one group, like something scary happens in the night and they knock on each other's doors to wake everybody up so that they can go fight Dracula, but they are quite successful. They're able to find many of his secret little hiding spots, his boxes of dirt, and they put pieces of the consecrated Eucharistic host in them to purge this hiding place so that Dracula cannot return. Mina, meanwhile, is only sort of part of the gang. She helps as much as they let her. She compiles all of their notes together into the book that will eventually become Dracula, but she's not allowed to come along for the more adventurous things because they want to keep her out of danger. Unfortunately, the men's efforts to keep her out of danger put her right in the way of harm. She's left alone for long periods of time, and in this loneliness, Dracula creeps in. He uses his servant Renfield as an access point to Seward's asylum, where Mina is staying, and begins feeding on her, inching her towards death in the same way he did Lucy. By the time that the fellows realize Mina's condition, it's too late. Van Helsing tries to purify her by placing a consecrated host on her forehead, but it burns her. Mina is already on her way to being an unholy undead. Still, the ever-faithful Mina does not let this discourage her. With the help of Van Helsing's hypnosis, they use Mina's telepathic connection with Dracula to track him down as he flees London to try and return to Transylvania. Van Helsing and Mina split from the group to go to the castle to destroy the remaining vampire women, and there they find the final resting and waking place of their foe. There was one great tomb, more lordly than the rest. Huge it was and nobly proportioned. On it was but one word, Dracula. This then was the undead home of the king vampire, to whom so many more were due. Van Helsing purifies Dracula's tomb, and that's it. He has nowhere to hide. The men intercept Dracula on the way to the castle, they pry open his tomb, and they stake and decapitate him. He vanishes into dust. With his passing, Mina's curse is lifted, and she becomes human and holy once more. Their only loss is, unfortunately, the cowboy who dies in the conflict, but for the most part, our heroes end the tale happily, safe in the knowledge that this evil has been taken from the world. Dracula was an unmistakable hit. It has never been out of print since its publication, and it was deemed so important that it was printed and handed out for free to soldiers during the Second World War. It is thrilling and engaging, but it also quite competently tackles the concerns of its era and many of the eras that have come since. And that's because at the very heart of this story lies the contrast between the old and the new. We have this relic of ancient high society, a count in his castle, slowly sucking the life force out of the wholesome and Christian everyday man and woman. His defeat comes at the hand of a ragtag group of good-hearted, God-loving people with the help of Van Helsing's very particular philosophy. He is the wisdom of the age that is to come, well-versed in newer scientific techniques such as hypnosis and blood transfusions, but also willing and ready to accept that there are some things in the world that he still does not understand. In a time that was struggling to integrate new technology without completely abandoning the old ways, Dracula came at the perfect time. But Dracula also exists in the vampire context, and I would argue that it responds in a lot of ways to Le Fanu and Polidori. While Lord Ruthven was suave and handsome, this unignorable part of high society, and in the end he is victorious, Count Dracula was fundamentally repulsive. He had all the trimmings of high society, but there was something about him that was off. You could see the evil in his eyes, in the strangeness of his demeanor, in the hairiness of the palms of his hands. Carmilla undercut a lot of patriarchal norms that Dracula then re-establishes. Mina is a relatively empowered woman. She reads, she writes, she has a very important role in the plot, but she also listens to and obeys men every single time, sometimes to her detriment. She does what she's told, even if it means that she gets Dracula'd, but this is the right choice. It all ends happily. She is saved, and she gets to end up with her beautiful husband and eventually a son. Lucy is probably a more apt Carmilla comparison, just because she really likes having attention put on her. She's a little bit more seductive and attractive, but in the end, she gets what's due to her, as she is killed and rendered holy by the power of men. Stoker was firmly establishing what was at the time considered a rightly ordered world. He begs these awfully ominous questions about the lingering nature of evil and the battle between the man and the monster, but in the end, it all goes well. Evil is something tangible and physically realized, and it can be killed by the grace of God and a willingness to accept and acknowledge the unknown. Dracula is a true display of the flexibility of the vampire myth, adopting and utilizing older stories whilst using the character to address and acknowledge new fears and concerns. And it also set a precedent for new vampire literature. Because vampires had such a mythic and storied past, new vampire literature must be in conversation with what came before it. It all exists in a vast web, a cauldron of story, inextricably linked to what came before it and what will come after. Count Dracula had been turned to dust, but the fragments of his story would be whisked off far and wide, whetting the imagination of a new century. And while literature would always be the backbone of the vampire saga, a new medium was emerging where vampires flourished: film. One of the very first recognizable vampire films was simply titled The Vampire, and it was released in 1913. It was inspired by a painting from 1897 and features a female vampire dancing, more a nod towards the seductive femininity of Carmilla than to Dracula. It's a simple story, and it didn't really do anything particularly revolutionary to the vampire lore, but it does set a precedent for how much vampires pop on screen. Even Bram Stoker described some of Dracula's more repellent characteristics as being in the physical. His lizard fashion movement, the look of his lips, the look of his eyes. Film is the perfect medium to capture that undefinable wicked quality. I don't think that any film could possibly embody this better than the 1922 silent film Nosferatu. This unauthorized Dracula adaptation was directed by F.W. Murnau, who took full advantage of the German Expressionism movement to create a vampire that is utterly inhuman and completely unsettling. Without sound to use as a tool, Murnau relied solely on the visuals to disturb and engage audiences, and it was incredibly effective. His Dracula equivalent, who in the German version is named Baron Orlok, is played by Max Schreck, who looks, well, horrifying. He is more rodent than man, and as a rodent lover, I wouldn't usually use that as an insult, but holy does this guy look insane. He is looming and creeping and just about as far from the suave Lord Ruthven as you could possibly get. The story loosely tracks with Stoker's tale, but I think that the visuals are really where this movie shines, taking full advantage of the medium at hand to create a vampire worthy of the most disturbing early myths. While Nosferatu made a bit of a splash in mainstream culture, it was far overshadowed by the film that came after it, Universal Pictures' 1931 Dracula. Universal Pictures had been considering a Dracula adaptation for some time, but after reading it, the studio readers were skeptical. It would be an understatement to say that times were tough. The Roaring Twenties had just collapsed under the weight of the Great Depression, and they didn't know if people would want to come and sit in a theater and hear people complain about fictional monsters while the world fell apart around them. For a while, Dracula sat and waited, but in 1929, Universal Pictures got a new 21-year-old studio exec who wanted a Dracula movie to be made, and since he was the man in charge, that movie got made. The script for the 1931 Dracula film was based on a stage play from the 1920s, and I mean this as a compliment. You can tell. The story takes place on precious few sets, which is something you see in theater a lot because it is hard to change the set and also expensive, but it is also imbued with this theatricality. You have the yawning foyer of Dracula's castle, the elegant manor, the artfully arranged balconies. And I think they were able to pull off this theatricality because they borrowed the stage play's star, Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi. I would honestly argue that more so than Lord Byron or John Polidori or even Bram Stoker, Bela Lugosi is the one responsible for creating the version of Dracula that we all know today. His accent is so distinct, his voice is so powerfully resonant, and his stage presence leaps out at you even through the silver screen. He absolutely eats the script up, lingering in these unnaturally long pauses, in bizarre expressions, all of these little tactics to let the inhuman slip into this human performance. Because it has become so widely recognized and iconic, I do kind of feel like Bela Lugosi's performance here gets swept under the rug, but it is absolutely a work of art. And you know what? Audiences of the time thought so too. Dracula was a surprisingly huge hit. It turns out that in a world plagued by fears like starvation, bankruptcy, and homelessness, it is kind of nice to get away for a little while and worry about Draculas. In a way, this vampire served the purpose that vampires always have, giving the people something to do in the face of inevitable destruction. The movie is definitely not a one-to-one adaptation of the books. They take a lot of liberties with the actual storyline and the characters. They change a lot of plot elements and also thin out the philosophy of it all quite a bit, but they still manage to get some of that core messaging across. Van Helsing says,
"I may be able to bring you proof that the superstition of yesterday can become the scientific reality of today."
It's absolutely not a perfect adaptation, but it wasn't trying to be. Movies of this time that were adapted from books often took a lot of their own liberties, and we will see this continue with many of the Dracula films to come. The raging success of Dracula cemented Universal Pictures as the makers of the monster movie for the first half of the 20th century, and they would go on to create and establish many more monsters, such as Frankenstein. There would be multiple Dracula follow-up films from here, but my favorite is 1936's Dracula's Daughter. The tale begins where the last one left off. Quite literally. In the 1931 film, it ends with Van Helsing being the one to kill Dracula, and we come into the scene of him standing over the corpse of Dracula, who's just died. And then, humorously enough, the cops show up, because he did just kill a guy. Van Helsing is dragged off to jail, and he requests that his former student, a man named Jeffrey Garth, be the one to defend him. From there, we follow Dracula's body, which has just been taken into custody. A mysterious woman, Countess Maria Zaleska, arrives, hypnotizes the guards, and takes Dracula's body. It's revealed as she ceremonially burns the corpse that this is the titular Dracula's daughter, a woman who was turned by Dracula to become his immortal companion. She invokes God as she burns the body, begging to be freed from this curse now that he has left the earth, but her prayers go up in smoke along with Dracula's body. She remains cursed and lures in and kills a young woman to sate her bloodlust. Meanwhile, Dr. Garth is struggling to handle Van Helsing's testimony. He is telling the truth that Dracula was a vampire and had to be killed, but Dr. Garth can't accept this complete breach in known scientific thought. Van Helsing must remind him of the flexibility that should be found in scientific thought. Plenty of things have seemed superstitious and strange before science was able to prove them real, so why not vampirism? By happenstance, Countess Maria Zaleska runs into Dr. Garth, and she realizes that he might be able to help her. After all, he's helped plenty of other people with their addictions. Why not her addiction to blood? He tries to help her, but it turns out that the Countess's condition runs much deeper than addiction. His efforts fail, and Dracula's daughter rears her monstrous head, attempting to turn Dr. Garth into a creature like her, to be her permanent companion. He resists, and she is killed, at last free in some way of her undead life. This story is interesting because it's one of the first mainstream examples of a story that prompts us to feel sympathy for the vampire. Up until this point, vampires have predominantly been viewed as fundamentally and unforgivably evil, but Dracula's daughter shows us a vampire who wants, at one point, to do better. There was no hope for Countess Maria Zaleska in the end, but she was one of the first vampires to beg the question, must this monster always be monstrous? But Dracula wasn't the only vampire on the scene in these days, and in 1932, Carl Theodor Dreyer released Vampire, a frankly trippy take on the vampire story that arguably leans more towards Carmilla than Dracula. The story is avant-garde and abstract, more about the odd visuals and incredible cinematography than a traceable story. My favorite fun fact about Vampire is that apparently Carl Theodor Dreyer, the director, wanted all of the spider webs that are seen on the set to be real, meaning that the production team had to herd spiders into the appropriate area so that they would make webs for them. They just don't make movies like that anymore. Which is probably for the best, but still, that's awesome. Movies such as Vampire make it clear that although there is this mainstream concept of the vampire as the sexy, staircase-striding villain, there has always existed a strange, subversive, and artistic underbelly to this story. Throughout the mid-20th century, Dracula remained the primary mode of the vampire. Dracula's sequels, Dracula spin-offs, horror movies, and comedy movies, most of them circulating around Dracula, at least in the realm of film. This trope had become well trotted out and perhaps even tired, but the realm of literature was still kicking, and Bram Stoker was not to be the last word for the vampire. In 1954, Richard Matheson changed up the game entirely with his vampire apocalypse novel titled I Am Legend. And if your only familiarity with this story is the 2007 film with Will Smith, do me a favor and go and read the book. It's not very long and it is very good, so go and read it. We'll finish this video first and then go read it. I Am Legend takes us to the futuristic year of our Lord, 1976, as a war has ravaged the planet, kicking up these terrible dust storms. We follow Robert Neville, a man who seems to be immune to this plague that has wiped out probably the rest of mankind. He's learned that these vampires follow eerily along with all of the traditional vampire tropes. They fear crosses, they can't stand garlic, and they can be killed with a stake through the heart. Armed with this knowledge, Neville does his very best to survive. He covers his house in crosses with garlands of garlic. He mass produces stakes during the night so he can go out during the day when the vampires can't walk, and he can slaughter as many as possible. But still, he's fighting a losing battle, both against the vampires and against himself. Neville falls into this all-consuming, alcohol-induced depression, unsure of why he's even trying to stay alive in the face of hordes of vampires and complete loneliness. Horror he had adjusted to, but monotony was the greater obstacle, and he realized it now, understood it at long last. It is only by getting to the root of this vampire virus that Robert Neville finds a purpose in life. A modern Van Helsing, he obtains a microscope and sets to work, taking blood samples, experimenting, and reading every resource available, from Dracula to microbiology textbooks. He eventually determines that the vampire disease is caused by a bacteria, which can become a spore and is transported by all of the dust storms. This bacteria can take over the living, but it can also reanimate the dead. And since things like sunlight and garlic can be deadly to bacteria, the hosts avoid it. The vampires are very strong and immune to bullets because apparently the bacteria causes a sort of glue-like material to form on the skin, and this can close around and encase bullets. But when you stake the corpse and you open up a bigger wound and air is allowed in before that wound can seal shut, the entire vampire turns to dust. More supernatural parts of this affliction, such as the fear of crosses, can be attributed to imagination. These vampires think they should be repulsed by holy symbols, and so they are. This is a somewhat absurd but still absolutely fascinating way to rationalize and scientificate, if that's a word, this vampire myth. Neville goes on a crusade using his newfound knowledge to kill as many vampires as possible, but he's simply going up against far too many numbers. He's found and captured by a group of vampires who are not the living undead, but are instead a group of living people that have the virus. They've developed and produced a drug that allows them to walk in the sunlight and to behave almost like normal people despite being vampires. And this group of new vampires is trying to form a new society, a society that Robert Neville could not be a part of. Any joy that Robert Neville might have felt over the fact that he's not alone on this planet is quickly crushed by the way that these people look at him. He has the blood of vampires all over his hands. He has been killing the living and the undead indiscriminately, the friends and family of the people that now hold him captive. He has become a danger, a monster, an abnormality, and he must be eliminated. Robert Neville looked out over the new people of the earth. He knew he did not belong to them. He knew that, like the vampires, he was anathema and black terror to be destroyed, and abruptly the concept came amusing to him, even in his pain. A coughing chuckle filled his throat. He turned and leaned against the wall while he swallowed his pills. Full circle, he thought, while the final lethargy crept into his limbs. Full circle. A new terror born in death, a new superstition entering the unassailable fortress of forever. I Am Legend. I Am Legend is a thrilling and chilling story, drawing the vampire myth up out of its gothic depths and redressing it for the new century. It speaks on fears like global war, epidemic, and germ warfare, and the creation of new societies with surprising nuance. Neville's complete apathy, especially at the start of the novel, is unnervingly familiar, and I think we can all relate a little bit to feeling like the world is moving on without us, like we have become something that no longer belongs in the society that exists. Matheson was able to turn gothic horror into science fiction, and to turn the individual vampire villain into an undefeatable horde. Whilst I Am Legend, as you may have guessed, ended up having more of an impact on the growing zombie genre, it did play its part in the vampire story. Vampires weren't just Dracula. They weren't just a single kind of funny-looking villain wearing a cape. They were something that could truly be a danger to humanity and to the way that we live. But Dracula was still hanging on, and in the 50s he got a shot of adrenaline straight to the chest in the Hammer Films production, The Horror of Dracula. Hammer Films Productions was a British film production company founded in the 1930s that made their name through lucrative, mid-budget, schlocky horror films. But the movie that really made them was The Horror of Dracula. This 1958 film starred Peter Cushing, a Hammer Films regular, as Van Helsing, and in the titular role we saw the breakout of Christopher Lee. He gave us a Dracula with the charm and sensibility of Lugosi, wrapped in the splashy, eye-catching visuals of classic 50s horror. So many of what we now know as classic Dracula tropes were established in this film. The fangs, the red luminous eyes, the scantily clad women and flashing capes. The plot of this movie is kind of just soup, as so many Drac films were at the time, but the Technicolor gore and the standout performances were able to sell the Count to a whole new generation of horror lovers. Perhaps the horror of Dracula's greatest impact was the inclusion of obvious sexuality. A sly kind of sexuality had been simmering under the surface of the vampire legend since the days of John Polidori, but it was here, right on the dawn of the sexual revolution, that it was allowed to burst to the surface. The flexibility of the vampire character really cannot be understated. No matter the fear, the transgressive intrigue, Dracula can handle it. As we move into the 60s, a thread begun by the tale of Varney the Vampire began to grow stronger and stronger. The concept of the sympathetic vampire. And the first major push into this region came from a rather unlikely place: daytime television. The show in question was Dark Shadows, which began its 5-year run in 1966. It was a daytime soap opera, meaning it had episodes coming out almost every day, and it was quite conventional for this style of television at the time, meaning that most of the episodes were filmed in one take, with one camera, in one performance, so that they could be made quite quickly and cheaply. Where Dark Shadows diverged from its soap opera contemporaries was in the subject matter. Dark Shadows transports us to the dreamy, melancholy town of Collinsport, Maine, where the eccentric Collins family deals with the drama of life and the occasional intervention of the supernatural. The show hit its stride after 200 episodes, with the introduction of its most iconic character, Barnabas Collins. Originally introduced as a villain, Barnabas is charming, handsome, and villainous, but motivated by love and loss. His more villainous actions, like kidnapping and hypnotizing young women, are always done out of pain from love lost. He is a villainous, but ultimately tragic character. Barnabas Collins was so beloved by audiences that he went from being a one-off villain to a series regular and arguably the main character. And across over 1,000 episodes of this show, we watch as Barnabas goes from being a villainous vampire to being a character deserving of love, as he tries to find his place in his long immortal life and in the modern world. In this strange new age and in an unprecedented format, Dark Shadows was able to create a very particular kind of magic, while also proving that audiences were still thirsty for vampire blood, even on daytime television. But the vampire had not been entirely forgiven of his monstrosity, and this came back in a big way in Stephen King's second and favorite novel, Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot follows writer Ben Meir as he returns to his childhood home, Jerusalem's Lot. Years ago, he'd been driven away from Salem's Lot by the town's choking, insular environment, as well as a bad supernatural scare he'd gotten from the ghost house on the hill. As Ben arrives, ready to take inspiration from the town for his next novel, some other strange company also appears. An Austrian man named Kurt Barlow, and his manservant named Straker. They have plans to open up a fancy new furniture store, but the people of the town are suspicious. Stephen King launches us right into this heart of this gritty, small town, into the evil that has been allowed to fester on its unoccupied streets. As Ben settles into town, falling in love with a young woman named Susan and befriending a local high school teacher, things start going wrong. First, it's a dog found gutted and strung up on the cemetery gates, and then a young boy goes missing. And shortly after this, people start dying. After a night's sleep, they wake up pale and weak, unable to walk into the sunlight. Soon they die, and the contagion spreads. After a late-night run-in with a boy vampire, Ben and his friends are forced to accept the unacceptable. There are vampires in Salem's Lot. This isn't an easy thing to stomach. Vampires are something from cartoons, from daytime soap operas. They're not real, right? But the proof is undeniable. Between the evidence that lies before their very eyes and their preconceived notions of reality grinds this friction that has been at the heart of the vampire story since the days of Bram Stoker and Van Helsing. Stop a minute. That word can't blocks up everything. That's where I was stuck. That absolute goddamn imperative word can't. I didn't believe Matt, Susan, because such things can't be true, but I couldn't find a hole in his story, any way I looked at it. The most obvious conclusion was that he had jumped the tracks somewhere, right? Yes. Did he seem crazy to you? No, but stop. He held up his hand. You're thinking cant thoughts again, aren't you? I suppose I am, she said. Once they've cautiously accepted their situation, Ben and his friends are joined by Mark Petrie, a young boy who's seen a vampire and is freed from doubt because he's a kid, and kids are better at accepting the unexpected. And they decide to hunt down Barlow and Straker to try and save the town, or what's left of it. It is a brutal and bloody conflict, and in the end, the only people to walk out alive are Ben Mears and the boy Mark Petrie. Susan is turned into a vampire and has to be eliminated, the teacher is killed by the stress of it all, and even the Catholic priest that tries to help them is killed by his lack of faith. And while the monsters of Salem's Lot certainly are the vampire and his spawn, Stephen King is getting at something much deeper. Beneath the individual and easily identified villain lies a much deeper layer of monstrosity baked into the foundations of modern society itself. The town knew about darkness. It knew about the darkness that comes on the land when rotation hides the land from the sun, and about the darkness of the human soul. There is no life here but the slow death of days, and so, when evil falls on the town, its coming seems almost preordained, sweet and morphic. It is almost as though the town knows the evil was coming and the shape it would take. The town has its secrets, and keeps them well. Salem's Lot is a truly horrifying story, and a very important entry into the vampire canon. Stephen King puts the monstrosity back into the monster, whilst also nudging at the deeper issues that lie at the heart of the story. Salem's Lot falls into contagion and blood in a matter of days, and as news reports indicate, no one notices. Mark and Ben are the only people that know what happened there. It makes you wonder how many other little dying towns there are like Salem's Lot, blinked off the map with none the wiser. Throughout the 20th century, the vampire legend drifted betwixt genres, flirting with science fiction and toying with the shock value of horror. But there is one story that would thrust it right back into the heart of Gothic literature, Anne Rice's 1976 Interview with the Vampire. Interview with the Vampire eschews the molds of Carmilla or Dracula and takes us right back to John Polidori's Gentleman Monster. The book opens in a dark room with a young interviewer starting a tape. The interviewer has met a man that claims to be a vampire. This vampire is named Louis de Pontulac, and he was born in the 18th century, 200 years earlier. Louis spins out a positively macabre tale of life in 18th century New Orleans, largely circulating around his maker, Lestat de Lioncourt. And while Louis is the vampire being interviewed in the Interview with the Vampire, Lestat is the vampire, with a capital T. He has all of the high society grace of Lord Ruthven, the sinister attitude of Count Dracula, and the wicked appeal of the 70s greatest rock stars. Lestat whisks the poor, unsuspecting human Louis into his orbit, showing him a world beyond his imagination, away from the petty grievances of mortal life, away from the strict standards that society imposes upon him. He, like Lestat, could become a vampire. And let's just say Lestat is a pretty convincing man. Louis recalls, "I forgot myself totally. As he talked to me and told me of what I might become, of what his life had been and stood to be, my past shrank to embers. I saw my life as if I stood apart from it." The boy's face was tense with a mixture of confusion and amazement. "And so you decided to become a vampire?" he asked. The vampire was silent for a moment. "Decided. It doesn't seem the right word, yet I cannot say it was inevitable from the moment that he stepped into that room. No, indeed it was not inevitable, yet I can't say I decided. Let me say that when he'd finished speaking, no other decision was possible for me, and I pursued my course without a backward glance." Unfortunately, Louis is a perpetually unhappy person. He was dissatisfied with his life as a human being, and that malaise does not lift when he becomes a vampire. Louis tries desperately to cling to his humanity. He refuses to accept that, as a vampire, he cannot keep living by a human moral code. But Lestat knows that in order to survive as a vampire, which he has done for hundreds of years, you have to embrace being one, with all of the horrors that come along with it. "Evil is a point of view," he whispered now. "We are immortal, and what we have before us are the rich feasts that conscience cannot appreciate and mortal men cannot know without regret. God kills, and so shall we. Indiscriminately he takes the richest and the poorest, and so shall we. For no creatures under God are as we are, none so like him as ourselves, dark angels, not confined to the stinking limits of hell, but wandering his earth and all its kingdoms." But still, Louis is unsettled. He wants to find answers about who he is, where vampires came from, the kind of person that he should be, and Lestat simply isn't giving him those answers. But Lestat is terrified of abandonment, and when he senses that Louis is getting ready to leave him, he does something that makes sure that Louis will stay. He welcomes a 5-year-old poverty-stricken girl named Claudia into vampiric immortality, creating a true monster. While Claudia is beautiful and preternaturally charming, and for a while she's pretty happy playing the happy little family with her 2 vampiric fathers, that bliss is short-lived. Claudia will never age. Very soon her mind outgrows her body by a mile, and she will be forced to live in the body of a 5-year-old for eternity, to be treated by society like a 5-year-old, and pretty soon she becomes a powder keg ready to blow. With Louis' help, Claudia plans on killing Lestat, poisoning him and burning him. They do it and they make their escape, not realizing that Lestat is a pretty hard guy to kill. They venture to Romania to investigate the roots of the vampire legend, but there they only find empty graves and senseless revenants, none of the vampiric company that they seek. Their prayers are finally answered when they end up in Paris. A coven of vampires has made their home there, living openly and freely as the Theater of Vampires, where they pretend to kill someone on stage in front of an audience every night. And they would be happy to take Louis and Claudia into their vampire family as long as they follow the rules. Unfortunately, the first rule, basically, is that you can't kill other vampires. Whoops. Claudia knows that they're in danger, and she wants to get out, but Louis is drawn in by the coven leader, a 500-year-old vampire named Armand. Armand is all the things that Lestat was not. He is kind, cultured, well-educated, and willing to share that education with Louis. He too, just like Louis, struggles with the problem of good and evil, and Louis falls for him in a way that he has not since he first fell for Lestat. Smitten, Louis is blinded to the danger they're in until it's too late. With the help of an avenging Lestat, Claudia is taken by the coven and burned, never given the chance to live out a full human life or a full vampire life. In the chaos, Lestat disappears, and Louis spirals, realizing everything that he's lost. He destroys and kills the Paris coven, everyone except Armand, and then he and Armand strike out from Paris to begin a new life together. Armand is thrilled because he believes that Louis is just the person that he needs to relieve him of his world weariness. After hundreds of years, he's tired, but Louis is young, Louis is fresh, Louis is passionate about things, so he'll save him. Louis denies this, insisting that he's a broken shell of a man, but Armand insists that that is what makes him the perfect embodiment of the new age. This is the very spirit of your age. Don't you see that? Everyone else feels as you feel. Your fall from grace and faith has been the fall of a century. But Armand's hopes are let down completely. Louis is a shattered man. Through all of the pain and loss he's experienced, the only thing he knows for certain now is that he will never be human again. He's not able to give back to the world, to contribute to society, to create anything new. He drinks in these bright, beautiful human lives to feed into the black hole of his immortal soul. I never changed after that. I sought for nothing in the one great source of change, which is humanity. And even in my love and absorption with the beauty of the world, I sought to learn nothing that could be given back to humanity. I drank of the beauty of the world as a vampire drinks. I was satisfied. I was filled to the brim, but I was dead. And I was changeless. Over the decades, Armand loses patience with Louis and leaves for greener pastures, and Louis sinks into a deep depression up until the point of this interview. He takes advantage of this opportunity to give one last thing back to the world, his story, and he spills his guts in all of their vivid, gory, toxic detail, and the boy sits, stunned, listening in rapt attention in his drugged-out haze. But after all of this, after hearing about these centuries of pain and angst and drama, the boy is ready to fall right back into the trap that initially caught Louis. Don't you see how you made it sound? It was an adventure like I'll never know in my whole life. You talk about passion, you talk about longing, you talk about things that millions of us won't ever taste or come to understand, and then you tell me it ends like that. I tell you, and he stood over the vampire now, his hands outstretched before him, if you were to give me that power, the power to see and feel and live forever. Louis snaps. His story of agony, the pain of his life that he's just spilled out, means nothing to this boy. He would do the exact same thing that Louis did. None of it matters. He attacks the interviewer, and the boy narrowly escapes. leaving Louis once again alone. That first book was quite a success, and it was followed up by the second book in the Vampire Chronicles, The Vampire Lestat, which manages to do a total tonal 180 while still clinging to that strong Gothic core. Instead of being trapped in Louis' endless ping-pong game between right and wrong, we are launched into the point of view of Lestat, the ultimate vampire. After reading Louis' rather unflattering report of him in Interview with the Vampire, Lestat decides that this needs to be fixed. Besides, he thinks that the world is ready, and he wants to come out as a vampire. He decides that he is going to begin his career as a rock star, and at last fulfill his dream of being admired and adored by everyone in the world at once. But first, he needs to tell his side of the story. Lestat spills out his tale, speaking of his humble upbringing and his undying lust for life. He's trying to make his way through Paris, discovering a love for the theater, when he is kidnapped and changed by a vampire. His maker gives him no explanation, no answers, no companionship. As soon as Lestat is successfully turned, he throws himself into the fire, leaving Lestat with nothing but a pile of money and abandonment issues. Lestat tries to use his money well. He uses it to found the Theater of the Vampires, which will later entrap Louis and Claudia. He runs into Armand and shows Armand and his coven a totally new way of life. Lestat is a vampire, yes, but he refuses to be ashamed of it. Why should death lurk in the shadows? Why should death wait at the gate? There is no bedchamber, no ballroom that I cannot enter. Death in the glow of the hearth, death on tiptoe in the corridor, that is what I am. Speak to me of the dark gifts, I use them. I'm Gentleman Death, in silk and lace, come to put out the candles. The canker in the heart of the rose. Lestat travels the world, learning about the origins of the vampires, meeting Marius, a vampire who's found meaning in life through making art, and the story ends where the first book began, with Lestat meeting Louis in New Orleans. It is implied that Louis' interpretation of events that he presented in Interview with the Vampire may have been, not entirely the truth, since he was rather bitter when he was telling that story. In the third book, Lestat's antics take it up a notch. He continues pursuing his goal of becoming a rock star, but he is so hot and so powerful and so vampire-y up on that stage that his music manages to wake the first ever vampire, an Egyptian queen. She's been asleep for a while, and she's had a lot of time to mull things over, and she decides that the only way to fix the world is to do a mass genocide and then restart everything. All of the vampires that we know, Louis, Armand, Marius, the interviewer who becomes a vampire at this point, it's a long story. Anyway, they all have to get together to stop her. They know that the world is far too messy for a simple solution like hers to be effective. Lestat explains, "History is a litany of injustice. No one denies it. But when has a simple solution ever been anything but evil? Only in complexity do we find answers. Through complexity, men struggle towards fairness. It is slow and clumsy, but it's the only way. Simplicity demands too great a sacrifice. It always has." This is the kind of thinking that reigns supreme in the murky, gothic world of Anne Rice's vampires. Nothing is ever simple. In the first novel, Lestat was portrayed as this villain, but by the second novel, you realize that he was just being himself. By centering some truly villainous vampires in her story, by telling it all from their perspective, Anne Rice has neutralized the morality of the world. In a world where our protagonists murder at least one person a day just to have their dinner, what does murder mean? In the deliciously amoral gothic world of Interview with the Vampire, the neutralized morality allows us to look past our human scruples to examine what true monstrosity is, and from that, what it means to be human. Sure, all of these characters are vampires and, they're all damned to hell one way or another, but the only way that you survive as a vampire, the only way you keep yourself from going completely off the deep end, is by desperately desiring to be something more. Even if it's not possible, you have to keep trying. You have to keep looking for some version of goodness. You have to contribute to the world, to make art, to give back, to find community, to do something other than drink in. Or else what's the point? Anne Rice pushed the capacity of the vampire story to its absolute limit, using it as a tool to explore some of the worst impulses and some of the most beautiful parts of the human experience. Though the 60s and 70s explored the limits of the vampire story's flexibility, Dracula still had not been left in the dust. In 1979, German director Werner Herzog released Nosferatu the Vampire, an homage and a redo of the 1922 Nosferatu. It nods to the classic film in a lot of ways, but the most obvious one is probably in the monster himself, who was modeled after the original beast down to the little rodent-like teeth. Klaus Kinski is fabulously animalistic in this role, and he makes a brilliant monstrous contrast to the Barnabas Collins and Lestats of his day. But outside of that central monster, Nosferatu the Vampire really is a work of art. It's a film that breathes, living in long scenery shots, in drawn-out character moments. But I think this film really shines in the way that it parallels vampirism with plague. Dracula sweeps into town like an epidemic, and within days there are bodies piling in the streets like cordwood. Throughout the film, this is visually represented by the presence of rats, traditionally the carriers of plague, even though that's pretty much misinformation, and I talk about that in another video, and I want to defend rats here, but they fill the streets. They're constantly underfoot, even during meals and dances. The town is infested by this contagion. This film ends on a sickening note. Mina sacrifices herself to kill Dracula, but it's too late. The plague has spread to Jonathan Harker, who wakes up looking an awful lot like our good old friend Dracula. He orders Renfield to begin the process of traveling to the next town, and the contagion spreads. This is not only an excellent way to play on our fear of epidemic and illness that we all still struggle with, but is also a fantastic nod back to the origins of the vampire story, where they were used as an explanation for the unexplainable. Herzog crafted an amazingly elegant unification of modern-day fears and ancient explanations. That same year, in 1979, another version of Dracula was released, this time starring Frank Langella. This one is pretty much just another Dracula redo, kind of loosely following the story, but it really shines in its star. Much like Universal's 1931 Dracula, this was also based off of a stage play, and once again, they brought the star over from the stage. Frank Langella dials Dracula's sexuality up to 11. He isn't just hunting Mina and Lucy, he's seducing them. Van Helsing, Jonathan, and Dr. Seward don't just fear Dracula because he's a monster, they fear him because he is capable of winning over the hearts of their women. This bleeding of sexuality out across the screen carries on in the cult hit 1987's Lost Boys, directed by Joel Schumacher. The title itself is a play on the Lost Boys of Peter Pan, but the writers also mentioned that they had been inspired by Anne Rice's child vampire, Claudia. They wanted to create a vampire movie with all of the flashy grunge and sex appeal of the era that could also engage with growing anxieties over young boys and the kind of trouble they got up to. The Lost Boys follows new in-town teen Michael and his younger brother Sam as Michael gets pulled into the wrong crowd. The really wrong crowd. The town is secretly plagued by a gang of no-good motorcycle-riding vampires, and Michael is pulled inexplicably into their wild lifestyle. He's tricked into drinking some of the vampire's blood, and it's up to his younger brother Sam to play Kid Van Helsing and defeat the leader of the vampire gang before his brother's transformation into evil is complete. There's plenty of jump scares, splashy gore, and of course, some utterly hideous vamps. It's the perfect blend of scary and cheesy with just enough heart to feel like it's worth watching. It ends with the boys' grandfather acknowledging what they've all been thinking.
One thing about living in Santa Carla I never could stomach. All the damn vampires.
The Lost Boys helped to show that the vampire story didn't have to have the elegance of Bela Lugosi or the gothic drama of Interview with the Vampire, or even the feel-good conclusion of Barnabas Collins and Dark Shadows. The vampire story could be wicked, campy, and fun. It could be a celebration of all that is dark and grungy and reprehensible in the best ways. But there was still plenty of sympathy for the vampire in the air, and in 1992 it manifested in Francis Ford Coppola's film Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was called Bram Stoker's Dracula because it purported to be an accurate adaptation of the book. And I'll admit, it probably is the most accurate out of the filmed versions of Dracula we've had, but that's not really saying much. The film takes plenty of liberties, especially when it comes to the treatment of Dracula himself. The film's tagline is "Love never dies," and that idea permeates it from moment one. Coppola proposes that Dracula actually is Vlad the Impaler, and that long ago he had a wife named Elisabetta. Elisabetta receives false word of Dracula's death, and in her distress over losing him, she throws herself off the battlement of the castle to her death. Dracula takes this as a slight from God himself and swears revenge against the forces of the world, claiming he will not see true death until he is reunited with his Elisabetta. Thus, he curses himself to immortal vampirism. Jonathan Harker goes to the castle, where he's greeted by a deliciously creepy Gary Oldman as Dracula. His plans to feed on Jonathan are interrupted by a picture of Mina. Mina has the same face as Elisabetta, and in her, Dracula sees an opportunity to reclaim his lost love. He takes on a far fairer form and travels to London to try and capture Mina's heart. She doesn't realize who this strange man is, and she is soon falling under his spell. He is everything that she could want: cultured, sweet, attentive, and wounded, and Mina wants desperately to be the one to heal his broken heart. From there, the story once again tracks with the book. As Lucy is killed, Mina begins to be turned, and they use her connection to Dracula to track him as he flees London back to Transylvania. They follow him all the way to the castle, crack open the coffin, all of that happens, only the Count does not turn to dust there. He makes it into the chapel where he first received his curse, and it is there that the love of Mina redeems him. She kisses him just before dealing the killing blow, and this act of love is enough to send the souls of Dracula and his Elisabetta to heaven. Coppola's Dracula very delicately straddles the line between villainy and sympathy. His backstory grants him motivation beyond sheer bloodlust, and through the eyes of Mina, we are able to see him as something broken and wounded and deserving to be healed. The story doesn't dramatically overturn anything from the original story, but it does begin to poke holes in the question of evil, and whether or not Dracula really is evil. In the first draft of this film, which was screened for test audiences, the film ends with Mina and Jonathan being reunited and embracing, the perfect couple at last. But the test audiences hated that ending, and so they cut it off, leaving us to linger with Mina and her now healed lover long after we've left the theater. This is a Dracula that has committed evil deeds. We've seen his villainous side, we know that he's done bad things. But those evil deeds don't necessarily make him fundamentally evil by nature. For those truly gentle of heart, there may be room to forgive even the vampire. Adaptations of the vampire story, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, paved the way for the growing genre of vampire romance. Paranormal romance, and especially vampire romance, began to gain some steam in the 70s, especially with authors like Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. Her vampire hero, Saint Germain, is a member of high society, he is handsome, and he's also surprisingly kind to the women he engages with. This opened the door for the onslaught of kind-hearted gentleman vampires, evil only in nature rather than deed. In 1994, the film adaptation of Interview with the Vampire came out, and it was a sufficient adaptation. I find that it neuters a lot of the more dark and subversive and interesting elements of the original story, but it fed into people's appetite for the brooding gentleman vamp in a big way. Most of the vampire romance of the 80s and 90s was built on the foundation of the Byronic hero, a nod back to our old pal Lord Byron. Characters like Heathcliff and Rochester set the gold standard for this Byronic hero, the brooding, handsome man who is solitary by choice and deeply plagued by inner turmoil that can only be healed by the hand of a gentle young woman. The Byronic hero was romantic catnip, because, like, I don't know the psychology behind it, but who doesn't love a really sad man? These kinds of heroes could be found in all different types of romance, but especially in the vampire romance. What could be more sad boy than a life of eternal death? In mainstream vampire fiction of this time, especially the stuff written for women, vampires had managed to shake off the inherent evil that they had borne from time immemorial. The vampire, rather than being a monster, was now just a wounded person who needed to be healed by love. A lot of these 80s and 90s vampire romances end with the vampire hero getting to live a normal life with the 2.5 kids in the white picket fence. Books, and later on shows like The Vampire Diaries, carried this Byronic heroism into the realm of the teen drama, where it flourished and set deep roots. But the thing is that this then required the vampire to change more, because when you're writing teen stories, it has to be even more sanitized. Sure, you can suggest that the vampiric bad boy did bad stuff in the past, but there's not really room for what vampires were usually like, with the ripping of throats and the rivers of blood and incest and all of that other weird stuff. The result of this neutering process was a dreamboat teen vampire who was almost completely severed from the vampire's transgressive roots. Vampires, at one point, stood for everything that was subversive. They were the seedy underbelly of high society, the embodiment of evil, a representation of plague and pandemic creeping into the world. They were drinking blood on motorcycles, doing unforgivable things to men and women alike. Sure, there is an allure to that chaos, to that kind of unbridled villainy, but that is a very separate entity to the appeal that these teen vampires had. Now, I don't want this to come across as a condemnation of that type of media. I absolutely agree that teen media is not the place to explore the depths of depravity in the human condition, but anytime significant changes occur onto these long-standing cultural tropes, it's something that should be discussed. The socially integrated vampire, then, is no longer a figure of deviance or subversion. Or, if he is, then it is that entirely ordinary level of deviance and subversion which exists within us all, and does little or nothing to impede the smooth functioning of our society. His human equivalent is no longer the grand, Byronic rebel scorning the society that condemns him, or even the sympathetic, misunderstood outsider, unjustly outcast for being different. Instead, it is the ordinary, alienated, white, affluent adolescent, outwardly privileged and well integrated, but inwardly feeling lost, lonely, angry, and confused, struggling to come to terms with physical changes and unfamiliar desires. But the girls of the 90s and 2000s weren't just falling in love with vampires. Some were slaying them. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, roughly based on a movie of the same name, started its run in 1997, and it was a huge part of the teen vampire story. Written and directed by Joss Whedon, the show reversed the blonde damsel and distress trope that has always dominated horror, and instead allowed its blonde heroine to do the world saving. Buffy Summers has been chosen by her bloodline and destiny to battle evil, whilst of course still trying to survive the trials and tribulations of the high school experience. Known for its balance between snappy dialogue and genuinely heartfelt drama, Buffy revitalized the vampire genre, presenting vampires as terrifyingly monstrous, but not always irredeemable. It was able to find that thin line between gothic immorality and the Byronic heartthrob vamp, maintaining just enough edge to keep audiences engaged and watching for years. Other vampire-slaying stories were also coming out around this time, such as Blade in 1998. Based on a Marvel comic hero, Blade is an action horror film following the vampire slayer named Blade, who is himself half vampire. His mother was bitten by a vampire just before his birth, meaning that Blade can do things like daywalk, but he is always being pulled towards the evil vampiric side of his nature. In a lot of ways, Blade broke the mold of the vampire story, first off in its casting. At this time, vampires were almost always played by white people, but Wesley Snipes was cast as Blade, and it opened up a whole new conversation about how the vampire analogy can be used to discuss race. And Blade himself is a really fun character. He's sort of an anti-Lestat and Louis. He is way more concerned with kicking ass and saving the world than losing himself in gothic melodrama. He's a troubled person, but defeating evil always takes priority over whining. In its genre, Blade also feels like a nod back to the science-fictionalized vampires of I Am Legend. This vampire virus is something that modern medicine and modern technology can combat. Once again, we see the sheer versatility of the vampiric monster, functional and highly effective in everything from a Matrix-style sci-fi action blockbuster to the teen drama. The 2000s really went to show just how far this range could go, as in 2005, 2 different vampire stories came out that are quite possibly on the very opposite sides of the vampire spectrum. And funnily enough, both of them star teen girls. In 2005, Elizabeth Kostova published The Historian, a gothic horror travel adventure historical fiction mashup. The tale spans multiple timelines and multiple generations of a family, as they all try to keep track of each other, whilst also tracking down Vlad Dracula. That is Vlad Tepes himself, the historical figure who is a vampire and is still around kicking up trouble. It is a dense and demanding story that digs its claws deep into the rich history of Central and Eastern Europe for the last 500 years. Multiple storylines spin out across letters and notes and recollections, but it is all pulled together around the core concept that history is now. Vlad Dracula's looming presence over history, time, and space, over our relationships, even today, is a very real and very persistent threat. Our main narrator, an unnamed teenage girl, observes, "For all his attention to my historical education, my father had neglected to tell me this. History's terrible moments were real. I understand now, decades later, that he could never have told me. Only history itself can convince you of such a truth. And once you've seen that truth, really seen it, you can't look away." But for all of the incredible presence that Dracula has in this novel, he's actually a fairly absent figure. The vampire is not necessarily a character, but more of a tool, a framing device to show the kinds of problems that people might face, especially historians. An obsession with the past causing a refusal to view the presence, being unable to lift your head out of the books and see what's really happening around you. The way that generational trauma can rear its ugly head through history. The Historian is an incredibly dense reimagining of the vampire story, and it makes for a rich and unique entry into its saga. That came out in 2005, which was of course the year that another saga began, the famous and perhaps even infamous Twilight. Twilight was created by Stephenie Meyer, an author who up until this point had apparently not written anything. As she tells it, this story came to her in a dream, in which a teen girl met with a glittering man in a meadow, and within just 3 months, Stephenie Meyer had turned out the first entry in what would turn out to be the biggest vampire story to hit the publishing world in the last 50 years. Twilight tells the story of a painfully average, clumsy girl named Bella Swan, who's just moved to the rainiest town in the United States, Forks, Washington. She has to find her way through a new school, and of course, she falls in love with the mysterious teen, well, he's 100 years old in a teen's body, the vampire, Edward Cullen. Edward is the zenith of the not actually that bad boy vampire that had been simmering under the surface for the last couple of decades. He is the gold standard. He and his family are vegetarian vampires, meaning that they never feed on people, only animals. He lives in this beautiful open concept house. He has a nuclear-looking vampiric family, and Bella falls head over heels in a matter of days for his killer protective instincts, his steely self-control, and the fact that he is literally so gorgeous that he glitters in the sunlight, which is why they have to live in the rainiest city in the United States, because they can only go out when it's cloudy out, or else everyone would think they're too beautiful. Perhaps you've figured it out from my tone, but I am not the biggest fan of Twilight. It was such a huge phenomenon that you kind of either liked it or you hated it because it was being shoved down your throat constantly. And I was a nerdy little kid with no friends, so I wasn't really cool enough to be in the liking Twilight crowd, so I had to land really hard on the side of hating it with the passion that only someone in middle school can generate. But I will say that some of the hate towards Twilight also comes from the fact that it is media created for teen girls, which people just really love to hate on. Now, I don't think Twilight is good, but I want to clarify that I think that people dislike it for the wrong reasons sometimes. And beyond it being not very well written and stuff, whatever, my main issue is that the vampires in Twilight are really weird. Like, I would almost argue that they're not vampires at all. Her vampires don't need to drink human blood. They can get by perfectly fine on animal blood. They don't have fangs. Apparently all of their teeth are just incredibly sharp. They can go out into the sunlight just fine. It just makes them sparkle a lot, and their like invincibility comes from the fact that they have really hard skin. Such hard skin that apparently when two vampires touch, it sounds like plates clinking together. My sister, who's a bit of a vampire expert, made the point that Stephenie Meyer's vampires are actually more similar to the legend around, like, the myth of trolls. And she kind of has a point. And we can attribute this strangeness to a couple of reasons. First off, the fact that she wrote the first book in 3 months and probably didn't think they were gonna pop off as hard as they did, so she didn't really think it through. And secondly, because Stephenie Meyer went into this series with a very surface level understanding of the traditional vampire canon. She has apparently denied any contact with Stoker's Dracula before she wrote the first Twilight book, and instead cites inspirations like Jane Eyre and the bands Linkin Park and My Chemical Romance. I would honestly put forward that Twilight was built entirely on a vague understanding of the heartthrob vampires of the 90s and early 2000s with a willful ignorance of everything that came before that. And ultimately, that right there is where my issue with Twilight lies. Stories are flexible. Tropes are flexible. They change every time a new person picks them up, and I think that is one of the most beautiful things about them. But when you are reusing tropes and tools that have a long, complex, and storied past, I don't like the idea of ignoring that precedent entirely. I think it makes for a thin and insubstantial story at best, and at worst, a willful reversal of everything that made that trope special in the first place. Stephenie Meyer's vampires are brooding and moody and self-critical, but at least in the story, they don't really have a reason to be. Edward talks all the time about how delicious Bella's blood would be, and how he can't taste it or he'll lose it and kill her and drain her completely dry. It's like the main source of angst in their relationship. It's an issue of self-control, and yet, every time he is forced to drink her blood for one reason or another, he doesn't really have any problem stopping himself. There's no follow-through. In Twilight, monstrosity has just been reduced to being a matter of self-control. The good vampires aren't monstrous at all because they've mastered self-control, and the bad vampires who are monstrous are the ones who just didn't really bother with it. Sympathetic monsters tend to destabilize the process of categorization by bringing the monstrous and the human closer together. Because Meyer's leading vampires are practically faultless, the binary between the normal and the deviant is transferred elsewhere. Thus, rather than critiquing or subverting the narrative function of monstrosity, the Twilight series enacts a reversal of the monstrous, revitalizing the polarity separating the normal from the deviant. Monsters in Twilight are not socially constructed, rather, they create themselves by giving into aberrant desires. Vampires began their life as purely monstrous. Demons from beyond the grave returned to prey upon the living and slake their endless bloodlust. Throughout the 20th century, that monstrosity began to be called into question, but in the early 2000s, with stories like Twilight, it was whitewashed completely clean. In the most popular vampire media of the time, the tastemaker for an entire generation, the monster had been turned human. The impact of the Twilight saga, its later novels, and its film adaptations cannot be overstated. It defined the careers of its starring actors. It opened a Pandora's box of not very vampire-y vampires, and it turned the supernatural teen romance genre mainstream. Twilight was huge, and like it or hate it, it would define the vampire for a whole new generation. Because of Twilight's sheer size and impact, it feels like most of the vampire media from the 2010s is in response, or at least in conversation, with the Edward Cullens of the world. Some movies, like the 2011 Fright Night remake, tried to reinstate the horror and pure monstrosity of the vampire. In Fright Night, Colin Farrell plays the new next-door neighbor Jerry, who is handsome and well-spoken, but might be hiding an astonishingly dark secret. Jerry begins picking off the members of the local community, and it is up to the teenager Charlie, with the help of his girlfriend Amy, and a Las Vegas magician to stop him. Fright Night is funny, action-packed, and horrifically gory, and it feels like a bit of a middle finger to the supernatural vampire romance. The animated kids film Hotel Transylvania came out in 2012, and it took us back to the classic form of Dracula with a twist. In it, Dracula is a devoted single father who's raising his daughter, trying to keep her safe by making her scared of human beings, much in the way that humans once feared the creatures of the night. This is a distinctly unvampiric Dracula. He doesn't drink blood, he doesn't kill people, but he has all of the right Lugosi-style accoutrements: the castle, the cape, the accent. But this Dracula must learn through the power of his love for his daughter that the world is not as evil as he once thought, and that in this new age there might be a place for monsters right alongside man. This is certainly a gentler entry into the vampire canon, and I'm not going to try and argue that it significantly contributed to the overall vampire lore, but it did a good job of reinstating at least the visual tropes of Dracula for the younger generations. In 2013, Only Lovers Left Alive turns up the angst by presenting us with the vampire couple, Adam and Eve. No, not those ones. But they are desperately trying to remain relevant and to cling to a reason to keep living in the face of a bone-deep world weariness. This is particularly acute for Adam, who spent his life creating music and advancing the sciences, but has found himself deeply disenchanted with humanity and all of its flaws. It's up to Eve, who's found passions and things to keep her going, to pull Adam back from the brink. How can you have lived for so long and still not get it? This self-obsession is a waste of living. It could be spent surviving things, appreciating nature, nurturing kindness and friendship, and dancing. You have been pretty lucky in love, though, if I may say so. The vampires of Only Lovers Left Alive are definitely vampires. They have the teeth. They can't go out in the sunlight. They drink the blood. Only their blood comes from very carefully sourced donors, and it's been years since they've done a proper vampire kill. At one point, an irresponsible vampire actually kills someone, and Adam and Eve have to try and get rid of a body for the first time in decades. By dealing with the problems of vampiric life on a very practical and realistic level, Only Lovers Left Alive ends up feeling oddly relatable. They're not pandering to our human sensibilities, they're not trying to put us at ease like the Edward Cullens. Instead, they are calling us to lean in and to begin to examine how so many of our own traits, our weariness, our boredom, our endless search for novelty, may be more vampiric than we're comfortable admitting. In 2014, vampires were given the mockumentary treatment with the hilarious and surprisingly deep film What We Do in the Shadows. Created by Jermaine Clement and Taika Waititi, What We Do in the Shadows is a loving tribute and a scathing critique all in one, introducing us to a sort of coven of vampires drawn together by the fact that they all share a flat. We meet Deacon, the 18th century rebel youngster who was once snared by a vampire's trap, Viago, a 17th century romantic on the quest to find love, connection, and maybe even family, and Vladislav the Poker, a medieval tyrant turned immortal. In the basement, of course, dwells Peter, a creature pulled straight out of the 14th century accounts of living corpses. Now, let's not get it twisted. These vampires are very funny, but they are monstrous. They fornicate, they kill without remorse, they drink, not wine. Viago is the only one reaching towards some kind of connection with the humans that they prey upon. He talks to them beforehand, he gets to know them, their goals, and what they're looking to do with life, before he drains them and gets their blood all over the couch. But the important thing to note is that the monstrosity of these vampires is not allowed to lend them any kind of grandeur. Instead, so much like us, they still fight over who's going to do the dishes, over what to wear on a night out on the town, and how to find enough virgins to keep them all fed. They accidentally turn a modern man, Nick, who at first is really excited to get to know his new vampire family, until he realizes that vampirism is not all it's chalked up to be.
But I can't sunbathe, can't watch daytime TV. I can if I guess I could. More than anything, just the chips. It's my favourite food, I can't eat chips. I hate, I'll say I'm over being a vampire, it's shit. So don't believe the hype.
What we do in the shadows drains all of the majesty, the thrill, the intrigue out of vampirism. No matter what sort of trope you want to talk about, the ancient monster, the dreamer, the bad boy, the medieval murderer, being a vampire is basically just like being a human, but worse. Immortality sucks, finding people to drink sucks, and even though you're dead, you still have to deal with most of the problems of being alive. Viago explains at the end,
they say that vampires' hearts are cold and dead. Definitely dead. But I don't know, I think I still feel things inside it.
this film and the excellent TV show that was based off of it, that came a couple of years later, was demonstrative of this ever-closing gap between the monstrous and the human. But it wasn't because the vampires were getting any less horrifying, it's just that humans might not be as perfect as we like to pretend to be. The 2010s were so full of vampire representation that I couldn't possibly talk at all. And while this oversaturation led to a bit of eye-rolling and talking about sparkly boys whenever vampires were brought up, it also meant that people were able to start doing some really interesting things with this well-trod trope. One of my favorite weird little films from this period is 2014's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is a Western horror directed by Anna Lily Amirpour, which welcomes us onto the grungy streets of Bad City. A young man who's struggling to make ends meet in spite of his drug-addicted father encounters the one woman in Bad City who's not afraid to roam the streets alone at night. This unnamed character drifts through the night on a stolen skateboard, knowing that she is by far the most dangerous person there, even if she doesn't look it. The film is dreamy, slow-paced, and evocative, almost reaching back into the silent film tradition of Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire. But by putting all of the power into the hands of what would traditionally and culturally be the weakest person, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night turns a lot of our preconceived vampire notions on their head. Is the vampire really a predator if she was invited into the home of a man who had fully intended to prey upon her? As she falls slowly in love with the boy that I mentioned earlier, there are multiple scenes in which this reversal of power is visually shown. The best scene in the film has him in his Halloween Dracula costume standing over her vulnerable neck. She has him pierce her ears with a safety pin, literally mimicking the action of a vampire puncturing a young woman. It is a slow and meditative film in which these two characters fall in love in a shockingly innocent way, considering the standard that has been set for highly sexualized vampires of the past. Although the world is dark and frightening and violent, these two find a love that is astonishingly and beautifully pure. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is an incredible display of how understanding a trope down to its deepest, most fundamental levels allows you to play with it in new and inventive ways. Throughout the 2010s, we were slowly waking up out of our Twilight-induced haze, but by the time the 2020s rolled around, I feel like we were really ready to do something fresh with the vampire story. People who had loved Twilight in its heyday were coming around to the fact that although it was enjoyable, it perhaps was not the be-all and end-all of the vampire story, and those who had had their stomachs turned by Twilight were willing to see somebody do something different with it. In 2021, the horror anthology series American Horror Story released its 10th season, titled Double Feature. The first half of this double feature, because it was 2 stories in 1 season for whatever reason, but that first half was titled Red Tide, and it's actually a very interesting play on the vampire story. A writer and his family move into a small Massachusetts town and quickly realize that something is wrong. The streets are infested with these roaming gangs of pale, hyper-violent people chomping at the bit for a taste of fresh human blood. This has been going on for so long that everybody in town acts like this is perfectly normal. The writer begins choking on his own writer's block, and so he goes into town where he meets a pair of artists that offer him a very simple solution to get his work going again. It's a little black pill. Allegedly, this pill will open up your creativity in untold ways, and as long as you keep taking it and you can handle the side effects, you can become unimaginably wealthy and successful in a matter of weeks. Now, that side effect, yeah, it is an unquenchable thirst for human blood, but wait, there's more. Turns out if you don't have the creative chops to live up to the pill, you become one of those gaunt, haunted wanderers, a completely inhuman animal. They explain this effect. It's almost like the non-creative ones can tolerate their lack of talent until they're confronted with it. Then their mediocrity drives them mad. It is a really interesting way of sort of I Am Legend style medicalizing the vampire curse, but what I'm really intrigued by is the way that all of this revolves around creativity. When trying to convince the writer to take his first pill, one of the artists describes it: "You chose to be a writer because you don't really live in this world. You observe it, you interpret it, you feed off of it. And then you sit and you put words together so that the poor suckers who do live in the world can see what they look like, who they are, why they hurt." The language here is very specific. Of course, what's happening in this town is vampires, because they are literally drinking human blood, but it goes deeper than that. Red Tide proposes that all creativity, all art, is a vampirism of sorts. You are taking in the life force of the world, people's joys, people's sorrows. You are just drinking it all in. Sure, you give something back in the end. There is an end product that you put back into the world, but does that not just feed back into the vortex of human emotion? Red Tide is very fun. It's gory, grotesque, and monstrous, but the real fear factor comes from just how real it is. Creativity is a hell of a drug, and if you let it, it can destroy you. I believe that this trend of finding the monstrous in humanity comes to its peak in Mike Flanagan's 2021 masterpiece, Midnight Mass. Midnight Mass welcomes us into the slowly dying island of Crockett, an insular fishing village being choked out by polluted water. The arrival of a new young priest named Father Paul revitalizes the community, especially as miracles begin occurring. People's eyesight is being recovered. People are reverse aging. The paralyzed are walking. For all that are receiving communion, it seems that God's blessing is pouring down upon them. This awakens a kind of religious revival on Crockett, headed by Beverly Keene, a somewhat radical believer well known to use her outward show of faith and devotion to get her way. For a time, it seems that Crockett has been blessed, and the people could not be happier. But in reality, there is something much darker at work. As it turns out, their old priest, Monsignor Pruitt, isn't just on the mainland, recovering from illness like they thought. He's back on the island in a new, revitalized form as Father Paul. The last time the islanders had seen Monsignor Pruitt, he had been sent to the Holy Land on a trip, basically, before he dies, but that trip ends in disaster. Lost in the fog of his age, Pruitt wanders off into the desert, but before he dies, he stumbles into a cave where he was found by a winged monster with glowing eyes. The creature attacks Pruitt and drains him of blood, but his terror is soon replaced by awe as the creature holds his bleeding wrist up to Pruitt's mouth. Through the blood of this creature, Pruitt finds himself miraculously restored, his age reversed, his ailments healed, and he is once again young and vital. He decides that this creature must be an angel, and that he must be not afraid, and that Crockett deserves to experience this miracle too. So he brings the creature back with him to the island. From an outside perspective, it is very easy to see this as madness. I mean, to us, it is obvious that this thing is a monster. It's a vampire. But for Father Paul, it's not that simple. In his cloud of religious fervor, in his genuine, heartfelt desire to do something to save his community, Father Paul is blinded to the danger that he brings back to them. His blind faith has rendered him blind. Within time, things start to go very bad. Father Paul himself undergoes a transformation as he dies and then comes back to life and then kills and drinks the blood of a local drunkard. He's horrified by this at first, but Bev Keane is swift to step in and explain it all away. After all, that man was a nuisance. He had hurt people in the past, and so this is just a sacrifice in the name of God. Between the urging of Beverly Keane and the island's growing religious revival, Father Paul remains blind, and he continues putting the angel's blood into the communion wine. I feel everything that is happening here is a matter of faith, not science. So I don't want to cloud this area with any doubt. Something is happening, shifting inside of me. I remember when I was younger, I experienced times of great spiritual growth, but that was just... it's nothing like this. It's like I can feel God moving inside me. In the end, he reveals this angel to the community, and all hell breaks loose. For most of the town, it's too late. They've been ingesting the angel's blood, so when they take the poison being handed to them, they come back as vampires. And for those who haven't been taking communion, they become dinner. As blood floods what was once the house of God, Pruitt awakes to what he's done, but it's too late. He tries to stop it, but Bev declares him a false prophet and takes charge. She begins planning an effort to take all of these new vampires to the mainland to spread the word. They are stopped by the sacrifice of a group of people, some of whom are religious, some are not, who are able to see through these layers of fanaticism and extremism and fight for the sake of humanity. Midnight Mass is fascinating to me because, while at first you see the vampire and you go, that's a vampire, in reality, the monster is not the beast. Rather, the monsters are the people that would weaponize belief, that would use the excuse of, a godly purpose to commit atrocities. It's those who are willing to see other people as mere objects and themselves as the sole deliverers of God's divine purpose. Just as the vampire proves himself invisible in a mirror, so the monster vanishes, and we are left gazing at our own reflection. In 2022, this narrow line between the human and the vampire was further explored by the television adaptation of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. And honestly, this show is like everything that you could want from an adaptation. It is not the books exactly, and that's what makes it so great, and I could talk about it forever, but I'm not going to. And that's self-control, baby. This video is long enough already. The show takes the basic format and the philosophical ideas laid out by Anne Rice and digs so much deeper. They rewrite Louis and Claudia to now be Black, and their journey takes place in the early 1900s, meaning that there is an entirely new racial dimension added to their struggle with the world and with Lestat. This isn't done incidentally, it is fully absorbed into their characters' journeys to the point where it's hard to imagine what the story would be if not for those characters having those identities. They also set the show in the modern day, staging it as a second interview after that first one back in the 70s flew off the rail. This allows for a much greater deal of self-reflection for all of the characters involved. It's not just the bitter, angry Louis that we got to meet in Interview with the Vampire, it is a much more nuanced and well-rounded look at the character. I honestly find this Louis much more likable. This change also means that the interviewer gets to have a far more prominent role in the story, and Armand is made a much more intense presence. And the amoral morality of these vampires is taken on with gusto. The thin borders between love and toxic attachment are splayed out for all to see. It is horrific and engaging, asking all of the right and the wrong questions. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire is truly a love letter to all things subversive and gothic about the vampire. In this story, they are horrifically monstrous, and yet still appealing. It says so much about the vampire, and even more about us. Interview with the Vampire feels like a celebration of everything we've realized the vampire can be. Monstrous and terrifying, enchanting and strange, alien, and yet so terrifyingly familiar that it makes us ask questions about what it means to call the vampire monstrous. Vampires, as soft and nebulous as they've always been, act like a sort of catch-all net, trawling the depths and the heights for all of our worst fears, our loves and our hates, and maybe even the things we love to hate about ourselves. Vampires are other, but over the past few centuries of vampire media, I feel that we've come more and more to terms with the way that the vampire reflects on ourselves. As the figments of our imagination, they say an awful lot about the imagination that they've come from. Now, please forgive this very gross description that I'm about to give, but monsters are like a cyst in the human imagination. It's this closed-off space in the body where we can shove off all of the contagions, all the things that sicken us. We can put them away into this little capsule and act like it's no longer a part of us. But in the modern vampire story, I feel like we are coming around to be willing to open that up, to face these fears head on, and maybe look at healing. Stories are far from just being entertainment. Since the dawn of time, they have been how we contextualize ourselves. They are what we say about us. Our monsters are written into our very DNA. The shape of the vampire is changing, will always be changing, shifting, and adapting to become what we need them to be. But maybe that is why we will always be looking over our shoulders, just however unlikely, to see if one is lurking in the shadows. You know, despite the fact that this video, at least based on the length of this script, is going to be feature film length, I wasn't actually able to get around to talking about everything I wanted to or could talk about vampires. I have literally read, watched, and listened to nothing but vampire media since like July, and let me tell you, that does some weird things to your dreams. So if you'd like to hear me talk about any more of the stories that I mentioned today, or any other vampire media, go ahead and let me know in the comments, because I'll probably do some more videos on this in the future. This video was insane, and I had so much fun making it. While I was doing my research for it, I kept just thinking to myself, I wish there was a book that just had like all vampire media and just traced like everything, how the vampire has changed over time. And then I realized as I was making the video that I'm basically making that, so hopefully it was definitive enough, but we'll see. I love making really comprehensive, in-depth, long-form video essays like this, and I am looking at maybe doing more of these on the channel, but that's going to be contingent on how this video does and how other videos like this do. So if you did enjoy this, consider giving it a like and, you know, share it with the person who, if they turned into a vampire, you would stake them, because I think that's the most profound form of love. I want to give a huge shout out and a thank you to my patrons, whose financial and emotional support makes huge projects like this possible, and to everyone in my personal real life who has listened to me talk about vampires and nothing but vampires for the last 4 months. You guys are safe now. I'm probably done. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in sticking around. I talk all about literature, media, especially the art of storytelling. A lot of my videos are about the Lord of the Rings, but occasionally I make videos about whatever I want. So, you know, if you want to stick around, we would love to have you. It feels like a disruption of vibes to do my normal outro here, but it would feel weird not to. So here goes. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.